us. We want to begin our lesson this morning with a question. Who is God? Who is God? This is a question that has been pondered by mankind since the beginning of time. Who is God? Overall, man has accepted generally some form of theism, and that is the belief in the existence of a God or multiple gods. But many of these beliefs are based on subjective interpretations rather than objective evidence. They believe what they believe because they feel it. It feels good. It sounds right, without having any evidence to back up their beliefs. Here are some examples. The ancient Mesopotamians, we would know them as like the Assyrians and the Babylonians. They were a polytheistic society, which means they believed in many gods. Not just one, but there were several. And here's just a few examples. They had Anu, who was the supreme god. Enki was the wisest god. Marduk was the king of the gods. I don't see what the difference is between that one and the supreme god, but to them there was some difference. They acknowledged all these different deities. The ancient Egyptians were also polytheistic in their belief, believed in many gods, and they even believed that gods were able to combine with themselves and create even more gods. But they had Ra, the king of the gods, Osiris, the god of the dead, and Horus, the god of war. All throughout history, the Greeks, the Romans, they had their own flavors of gods. And our modern culture, we have our own variety of gods. We have the god of science, the god of politics, and the biggest one of all, the god of self. We have set ourselves up as being God, as having the final say. The problem with all these gods is that there is no evidence that proves they exist, let alone that they can claim the title of God. There is nothing that points to those ancient Mesopotamians and Egyptian gods as having existed. And there is sure nothing that can point to these gods of today and say with 100% certainty these exist. The honest examination of all the evidence demands only one conclusion. And that is the God revealed in the Bible is the only God. The only one. Not one of many, not an option, but the only one. And so we're going to begin a new series with that in mind. The goal is to explore the definitive statement, who God is. It's not a question of whether or not He exists, but rather, since He does exist, this series is going to enumerate the qualities, attributes, and characteristics that He possesses. If our theme was to have an underlying text, kind of a base text for the entire theme, it would be Psalm 46 and verse 10, which says, "Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth." I firmly believe that there is a lot that we can know about God. There is a lot that He has revealed about Himself to us that we can know with 100% certainty. And the more that we can know about Him, the more that we are able to exalt Him before others. The more that we are able to increase the knowledge of others as far as God goes. And the approach to this series will be as simple as knowing our ABCs. We will go from A to Z, establishing traits and therefore knowledge about God. If you did not already pick one up, there is a handout on the back table that has the entire list of the traits we will be considering throughout this series and the verses that accompany those traits. My hope is that you will be able to take these and help teach others about who God is. Now, I'll admit, some of the letters were difficult to use, like W and X. That took some thinking to come up with some qualities and traits that began with those words. And those two in particular are accredited to the person of Jesus. And the reason I went this direction is Jesus himself said in John 10 and verse 30, I and my Father are one. I and my Father are one. During his time in this world, Jesus was God, a deity in the flesh. To say that we cannot gain knowledge of God through the person of Jesus is a big, big mistake. In fact, I want you to see how the Apostle John opened his gospel account. Mike referenced the first two verses as he was presiding over the table this morning. But in John chapter 1, I want us to look specifically at verse 1, verse 2, and verse 14. You'll notice at the bottom of the screen I have a little legend that describes how I highlighted and boldened some of these words, because I think there is a lot to unpack in these three verses. But beginning in verse 1, it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we beheld His glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. The words that are highlighted in yellow, that's the who. The Word, He, His, the only begotten. It's talking about the same person. The blue shows the relationship of that person to the Father. He was in the beginning. He was with God. He was God. And then it says, the only begotten of the Father. That makes this individual in yellow the Son. The only begotten of the Father. The green is what this man did. He became flesh and He dwelt, meaning He was able to be seen and realized. It wasn't a myth, it wasn't some story that was conjured up. There was physical evidence that He was here. And the red shows us exactly that people did witness it. That He became flesh and dwelt among us. And that we beheld. We have eyewitness accounts of who Jesus was. And then the gray is what He accomplished. Being flesh and dwelling among man. Glory, grace, and truth. John lays out plainly in these three verses that Jesus was God. And that He was beheld by man. That His greatness was witnessed. That His greatness was claimed. To use examples of Jesus to further prove who God is not a stretch. It's a biblical truth. And so I pray that this series helps to reassure you exactly who God is. And encourages you to share this knowledge with those who are seeking to know the same. Because in our lesson a couple weeks ago, what we can learn from the Asbury revival, we established there are people that are looking. There are people that are desiring to know God. Unfortunately, they don't have the truth. They need the truth. We need to share it with those that we come into contact with. And so we're going to begin this series with letter A. and consider that God is absolute. He is absolute. Now, we use absolutes every day of our lives. Math, that's an absolute. 2 plus 2 will always equal 4. And if you find the most complicated math problem that you can find, and I looked online just to see what was out there, and it quickly made me dizzy, and I stopped to see just how difficult some of these math problems are. And I look at that, and I'm like, this has more letters than numbers in it. How am I ever going to know what the answer is? I may not know the answer. But because 2 plus 2 equals 4, I can know that there's an absolute answer for even the most complex math problem. What I call laws of nature are absolute. The sun always rises in the east and sets in the west. It never reverses itself. The freezing point of water will always be 32 degrees Fahrenheit. This is an absolute. It does not change. The reason such things are absolute, universal, unchangeable in nature, can be attributed to the absolute nature of their Creator. Because God is absolute, He created that which is absolute. Man did not create math or nature. We didn't sit down and devise 2 plus 2 equals 4. We simply came to the understanding of what had been created by the absolute God. I want you to consider the words of Isaiah. In Isaiah chapter 40 and verse 8, Isaiah writes, "The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God stands forever." Plants have their cycles of blooming and decaying. We understand this. They change. And we even accept that as an absolute. That during the spring and summertime, plants are going to begin to come into bloom. And then in the fall and wintertime, they're going to begin to die off in preparation of beginning the process again. But in contrast, God does not change. There is no variation with Him. There is no period of decay and period of blooming. He is constant. Is this not what God said through the prophet Malachi? In Malachi chapter 3 and verse 6, "For I am the Lord, I do not change." We are surrounded by evidence that points to the absolute nature of God. If math and the freezing point of water had been created by man, then man would be able to alter the conclusions. If man had sat down and come up with this on his own, then another man could come along and change everything and rewrite the laws of mathematics and rewrite the laws of nature so that they do not match what previously existed. We see this with technology, do we not? Ever changing. Always adapting to something else. But in the days of Noah, when he was measuring to build the ark, 2 plus 2 still equaled 4. Just as it does today. I can start proclaiming, if I wanted to, that 2 plus 2 equals cookie. Which I kind of like that math problem. 2 plus 2 equals cookie. But proclaiming does not equal proving. We can get up, mankind can get up and say a man can be a woman. Man can get up and say life does not begin at conception. Proclaiming does not equal proving. The evidence is against them in all things. A man cannot be a woman. Life begins at conception. 2 plus 2 equals 4. These are all absolutes developed by an absolute God. And we are powerless to change anything that He has set in motion. God being absolute in relation to the physical is proof for us that He is also absolute in relation to the spiritual. If there is evidence that God is absolute over the physical earth as we know it, over principles that our lives depend on, that is all just pointing to an even greater piece of knowledge that He is absolute over the spiritual. This means that we who are His children can have confidence. I want you to look at 1 Peter chapter 1. 1 Peter chapter 1. We're going to read verses 3 through 5. Peter writes, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who according to His abundant mercy has begotten us again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, to an inheritance incorruptible and undefiled, and that does not fade away, reserved in heaven for you, who are kept by the power of God through faith for salvation ready to be revealed in the last time. As sure as I am that 2 plus 2 equals 4, I can be equally sure of my salvation." Peter says that it is incorruptible. The inheritance is incorruptible. It is undefiled. It does not fade away. It's being guarded in heaven by God. How can I know that it's still there? Because God is absolute. Because God does not change. Because what God has willed into existence will remain so. You see, the idea of absolutes in nature really is to help us understand the absolutes in the spiritual as well. God has given us the ability to comprehend His absolute nature as it applies to our physical lives as well as our spiritual. There is no reason why anyone who is a child of His should ever question the legitimacy of their inheritance. Should ever question whether or not God is going to do what He said He will do. It is so troubling to hear so many Christians talk about that they hope they go to heaven. Friends, that's not a hope, that is a guarantee. If we be faithful to God, He will be faithful to us. There is no reason for us to call into question the legitimacy of our salvation. Believe in it just as you believe in 2 plus 2 equals 4. In addition to God being absolute, God is also benevolent. He is a benevolent God. Simply put, benevolence is the desire to do good to others, an act of kindness. But many want to characterize God as being this entity that is waiting to punish people for stepping out of line. He is an overzealous hall monitor, if you will, where His sole purpose is just to sit back for someone to mess up so He can swoop in and delve out the punishment that He wants to. But it's revealed to us that God blesses everyone, even those that stand against Him. Even those that stand against Him. God blesses everyone. I want you to look at Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5, beginning in verse 44. Notice what Jesus has to say. "But I say to you, love your enemies. Bless those who curse you. Do good to those who hate you. And pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven." Let's pause right there. On the outset, people could be looking at this saying, "Jesus, what you're asking of us has never been asked of before. Love our enemies? Why would we want to do that? They are our enemies. We're not supposed to love them. We're not supposed to treat them with kindness. They are against us. But Jesus' instructions to his followers is not without precedence, because look at what he goes on to say. Speaking about God, for he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. God displays benevolence in that everyone are recipients of his general grace, reaping the benefits of life. Could you imagine if God only caused growth and provided sustenance for those that followed him? Where you would only benefit in this life, you would only have what you need to survive if you were one of God's children. And so you had this like utopia of an area where all of God's children could dwell, knowing that they would be cared for. Or maybe there would be pockets of progress and plenty, and around it all this barren wasteland of nothingness. People would be turning to him in droves. People would be coming to him left and right, but it would be for the wrong reason. Much like those Jesus addressed in John chapter 10 and verse 6, John chapter 6 and verse 26. When he said, you're only following me because you got your bellies full. You're not following me because I'm the Messiah and because I can offer you eternal salvation. You're following me because I gave you a meal. Those that follow for that reason will not last. And we see that throughout Jesus' ministry, that when the going got tough, they got going. Because they didn't sign up for that. They just thought they were going to get a free meal and a good show every once in a while. They didn't want to devote their life to him. God is benevolent in that he provides completely for his creation. But why? Why show benevolence towards those that reject, even hate him? Those that even deny the existence of God, the atheists, the agnostics, those that get up and debate in public forums that there is no God. He does not exist. That he is just a figment of someone's imagination. God even provides for them. Why? It's to demonstrate that God values all souls. Look at Romans chapter 2 and verse 4. Romans 2 and verse 4. Or do you despise the riches of his goodness, forbearance, and long-suffering, knowing that the goodness of God leads you to repentance? God desires all men to be saved. That's what Paul wrote to Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 4. The goodness of God is to show how much he cares for the spiritual side of man. His benevolence attests to this very thing, that God cares for us. If he didn't care, then he wouldn't provide. If he didn't care that all men come to salvation, that all men come to him, then he wouldn't provide for all men. But God's benevolence goes much deeper than physical things, than just providing the physical. In Romans chapter 5 and verse 8, Paul would say, God demonstrates his own love toward us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. I see a correlation between this verse and what Jesus said in Matthew 5:45 and following. God sends rain for the evil and the unjust while they are evil and unjust. But God gave his Son for sinners while we were still sinners. It was not owed to us. It was not owed to mankind that Jesus come as a sacrifice. It was not deserved. God did not owe us any kind of sacrifice, but yet through His benevolence, it was freely given. Through His gracious nature and His love for His creation, He made available the only sacrifice that could reconcile us to Him. And He did it while we were yet sinners. Our God is a benevolent God. He gives it to us freely. And while some take advantage of His grace, and they think that it's all for the physical, that it's just to have the best life here that one could possibly have, we need to help instruct people that God's benevolence here is to show just how benevolent He is in our spiritual lives as well. The amount of grace and goodness that God bestows upon us in a physical way is made available in a spiritual way to each that will respond and submit to Him. I hope these thoughts will help strengthen your confidence in the security and the generosity of God's nature. Our God is absolute and our God is benevolent. 2 letters done. 24 to go. I hope you get a sense of where we're going with this series. Because we are His children. And we should be able to explain who our Father is to those that are looking. We are on our way to knowing who God is and having that knowledge of God that He wants us to have. God wanting all men to be saved, as we referenced, includes every person here. Every person that can logically understand and comprehend. God desires you to be reconciled to Him. Don't mistake God's goodness as acceptance of your sins, and that is where a lot of people make a very critical mistake. Well, if my life was so bad, then wouldn't God show me somehow? If my life was so bad, wouldn't I be less successful in my endeavors? Not necessarily. God doesn't operate like that. There are very faithful men that have hit rock bottom when it comes to the physical, that have lost everything for one reason or another. And it seems that the most immoral people in the world are the ones that have the most power and the most money at their disposal. But God providing for them is the same as God providing for us. It's to show what He has to offer spiritually. It's an invitation to receive His salvation. Will you accept what He offers today? The greatest gift that can ever be given is waiting for you to receive. But He will not force it upon you. He will not make you submit to Him. That's not a faithful follower. That's a robot. We have the ability to choose right and wrong. We have the ability to choose salvation or eternal punishment. And that choice is made by each and every individual. When you believe God's Word and it moves you within your heart to understand the severity of your sin, that it has separated you from God. And upon that realization, you understand, I can't continue in this way. I can't continue to live a life of sin. I need to turn and live a life for Him. And you acknowledge that Jesus is the Son of God. That's the only name given that will bring salvation to mankind. You make the decision to be baptized. I'm not going to force you in the water. I'm not going to come out there, grab you by the scruff of your neck and throw you in and say, there, you're baptized now. It doesn't work like that. It's got to be a decision made from the heart. A decision made to submit to God. This is regular old Carter County water back here. There's nothing special about it. But what takes place in the moment of that submission, that's what's special. Is you are giving yourself entirely over to God and what He has said. And through that submission, God removes your sin. And He adds you to the church purchased with the blood of His Son. And then as that new creature, being born again, as Jesus would instruct Nicodemus in John chapter 3, being born again, we are a new person. Oh, we still look the same outwardly, but inwardly we are new. And as that new person, we strive to live faithfully for Him. We will make mistakes. We do not become perfect. But God does not demand perfection. He demands faithfulness. And all of that, all of us have that within us. To be faithful and strive to live a life pleasing to Him. If you are not a Christian, please don't wait any longer. God is absolute, and He has said this time will end. This world will end. You may have rolled the dice up to this point and came up lucky. But at some point, this is going to be your last time to answer God's invitation. And He is benevolent. He has given you this opportunity to receive the salvation He has granted to mankind. If we can help you respond to God's invitation, let us know by coming down to the front as together we stand and sing.